Some are just moving right on through. And what do you see? What do you do? I'm actually seeing a little bit more movement now over these years. People being more responsive, at least being more aware and being more focused on what's going on. And that's a little bit encouraging. I wish we were a little more quickly rallied up on point onto what we need to be doing, and doing so then persistently. And that'll just be, I guess, my ongoing hope and wish, and whether or not I'm ever to relieve ourselves of the cricket nature that we are is really up to us, I suppose. Before I get too lost, BTWRLM229. For those on Recast, Pastcast, and Prodcast over at ucy.tv. Thank you, Jules, again. Playing these broadcasts on through. I was had the occasion to have to listen to an older broadcast looking for something in anticipation of what I'm going to be talking about a little bit today, and listening through it, listening for the subject matter I was going to talk about or talk to. I have to say, folks, going back even just to first of the year, I'm not that far off on things. I haven't been. And so I suppose it is more astonishing to me that we don't have more and more people coming to the ideas that we need to. We get lost, again, these breads and circuses that we see going on. Really enticing and inducing to keep us off of what we need to, and then also to cover other things that are going on. As you know, I've been through years identifying one possibility is that we live under an occupied territory. We live in an occupied territory under occupiers, and we can call that Battlefield America. We can call that whatever you want. It's certainly not the government that was a republic we should keep, and I think that's the main key. However, we want to characterize, and it seems that this seems to be coming up a theme, lots of characterization, but nobody has any substance to put on the bones of what we're talking about. And it seems very clear no one has any actual foundation. And again, I try to come once a week just to give some of that in a very generalized way. And like I said, don't see a lot of work, but I see just enough. At least it keeps me coming back every week. It seems to me on my side to be the same old story, just different ways to say it. But different people step up with their interests and the thing they need to fix, and I interact with them, and I see that there is some influence that I can do to help hasten what you all need to do in your own private areas. And hopefully, I would like to see that it all starts to blend together to make a more unified action. So, again, getting back to this military consequence that I believe that we can see clearly, and the thing that we've been told, and anybody that's been listening to me for any length of time can go read all the documents yourselves. We look at seeing whether or not, sometimes you feel a little bit nuts about this, like, are you insane? But periodically you'll get the information from those that you understand are doing this to you. They're not supposed to be, but they are. And there may not be such an easy remedy, but there's the problem. And this is the facts of the reality we live in, and you can call it anything you want, you can blame whoever you want, you point the finger, but the bottom line is the people themselves were obligated to constrain all manner of usurpation. But here, let me get to the point of this today, just to let you know, you can read it yourself. Official Air Force document outlines military assistance to insurgencies. And the way I look at myself, what I'm doing, and what about you? Maybe I'm not sure about you all, but maybe you too. I'm an insurgency, it seems, against this overthrow and this occupation. So I'm just wondering when the Air Force is going to be assisting me. When do we get our material drop, our airdrop, to supply us to fight this insurrection that's happened in the domestic invasion that the government, the Army and the Air Force itself has failed to stop inside the gates? is the way I looked at this. But the Air Force is ready to aid insurgencies, according to the lengthy new Air Force document, which outlines U.S. strategies for irregular warfare. Military sources will sometimes be needed to help insurgencies in foreign countries. There's a 103-page document you can download. You can wait for the blogcaster update to get the link to get this if you want. You can read it for yourself. I tend to want to read, but I just also to expose all this, but I don't know why. I don't know why I'm needing to read a lot of this. You can't quite get the idea. If you're not interested, then I'm wasting my time anyway. If you do get the idea, then you'll be hot on this to get the information. My thought on all this was they didn't get this policy unless they were practicing it somewhere. And my look at this was that if we needed more proof, this was the proof that, again, the United States of America has been meddling in other people's countries, in their democracies, so-called, whatever government they have established for themselves, over longer times than what the United States has ever existed in. And we're seeing the evidence again. If the United States government will not admit it, we see that they are meddling and doing things to see what works and what doesn't. And they're using other people's populations to do it, and those people are dying in this experiment. And I say look at the Middle East as the carnival mirror, and contorted as it is to look back at you all here at the United States of America. And as I say, understanding battlefield America, this means they're focusing on us. And we've had the other documents of the other departments of government, of the Army, the military, that have explained they're doing this at all. This document actually shows that a joint effort will be made in the enforcement of this irregular warfare wherever they tend to drop it off into people and to interfere. There is no constraint. The murder memo, as I talked about it a long time ago, it says that the United States government has gone extrajudicial. There is no judiciary. There's no review. They have no governmental things. They have no governmental establishment. These people are rogue. And remember, you talk, this is a foreign thing. It's about foreign governments. Well, before you get running too far, remember the United States government and the United States district is only a district, not a state. Y'all outside of that district are foreign to it. So don't think you're that this discussion is too far away from within the borders of the United States. My primary point is this is just to me was an agreement with the fact of the interference of the United States, where it claims to be the white knight. It's really just a brutal brute in the world, and it really doesn't deserve the any idea that it's not harmful in what it does. And I'm embarrassed for it. It's not even got scruples enough to be embarrassed for itself. Then I live in this area, in this territory, so-called, that is an embarrassment to me. And then we see our helplessness against it. Certainly on a one-off, when you work each people out to how they, men or women, are working this. If you're not, you're going to be a subject to this inflammation from the boil on the butt of America. This is a serious kind of consequence that's going through the world, and I don't know. I just get kind of contemplative about where we are. I know at some point, I guess I could just don't worry, be happy, move on through. But there's something about this that's just not quite right, and we shouldn't be allowing to enjoy this kind of a murderous gang banging that the United States does in the world. Moving on, all these battlefields in the world, I wanted to touch back on something. I just leave some certain things out sometimes. Sometimes I forget, and sometimes I do it on purpose. Today, I want to come back to something I left on purpose just to think about. Remember we talked about Steve Bannon being booted? And he resigned, and now he's going to go back. And he says that the old Trump that he promoted is no longer in the office. I wanted to remind you that Steve Bannon, remember, I think it was not even 1 month before, was put on the hit list by the Pope Francis. His aides, remember, Pope Francis attacked Steve Bannon as the promoter of apocalyptic geopolitics. He's out. In 30 days, he's gone. I don't think that was a unmeaningful coincidence. In fact, I think it is the consequence. In fact, the Vatican creates the apocalyptic geopolitics on another level that I think is hidden inside this whole structuring as well. As this cloth, this evil cloth is woven in the world. I just want to remind you that that happened. So we got 30 days, and Bannon's out. He's attacked by the Pope. I told you the apocalyptic geopolitics is the Vatican, and I referenced all those things before, and I talked about them last year. And let's move back in through what happens. We talked also last week. I said the governor had signed this confiscation, this extreme risk bill that would take away your Second Amendment rights. Tied in with the Pope and is the fact that the Holy See. Now remember, these are all different entities, but the Holy See is an advisor in the UN. It's not in a state capacity. It's in an advisory capacity, and its attorney is the International Bar Association. And after I talked to you about the Oregon governor signing this risk thing, where the government can essentially say you're danger and you have a gun and we can come and get it. And why wouldn't that military force want to take your Second Amendment right to protect yourself against it? The very purpose for the Second Amendment. I told you that in fact, the Oregon governor is a bar member. The people who advanced that bill were bar members, and I said if you think you're going to go to a judge bar member, the Bar Association is an agency of the state of Oregon and other states. If you look, you don't have to look so close to see this. You realize that's one of the occupying forces. That how would you go before one of those members who are an NGO? The organization is an NGO to the United Nations, who espouses the not tied in a barrel of a gun. How are you not going to be? How are you going to be fairly? How is justice rendered before these folks that agree that you shouldn't have arms? And it wasn't not even 1 week later. I think I got this from Grimner again, right on time, folks. Like I said, if I don't get to it in the week, these things are happening so fast. It's like old news. And I'm not here to say the news. I'm here to tell you what's coming and how to see it and how it integrates so we can do something. And American Bar Association comes out within the week and is now on record to ask the states to adopt firearm confiscation laws. And so, as I responded, and I can't remember exactly the response, I said, now that it's open, the gloves are off. This American Bar Association, which the bar associations in the states are beholding to. I've read all the House delegate resolutions from the bar, who espouse the international order, is now imposing it on you in the open to take away your Second Amendment right to counter what they're doing in one option. So the gloves are off, folks. This is now clearly what I was suggesting to you would be coming and would be being exposed. There's no curtain to pull back now. It's in the open. American Bar Association asks states to adopt firearm confiscation laws is what they're asking that the Oregon state already signed in. So as I tell you, the pioneering police state or the military state is Oregon. There it is. It took the lead before the bar came out to agree to it. But this is being pushed through all your states. So this is, you got to understand, the Bar Association is an agency of the state. Its members are your politics. The many faced bloodsuckers. They are the judges. They are the defense attorneys in the conviction. They're the prosecutor. They're your AG. They're the ones that bring also the university system. Law schools have all the students to make all these laws and shove them through. As we found out in 2013, they shove these bills in pieces and parts, and so you don't see them coming through. It's unlike what we see here about this firearm confiscation. This is a different type of obfuscation. But they shoot these bills through in pieces, and then the people that are on the other side, once they get passed, the people inside the government know how to reconstruct all these bills in order to get them to be what they intended to be and get them past everybody's perception. This confiscation stuff is now up in the open. they've been wanting your guns, folks. I mean, I just don't know what to tell you. But even though I tell you it's not the option, I also offered you reasons why your gun is important, even if your arm is important. To keep and bear completely and unobstructed by any limitation is important, even if you didn't want to opt to take out the very people that are now pushing this, that you have a right of felony arrest in sensitive places. When you see these officials feloniously violating the law, you have a right of felony arrest. That can include killing someone who is resisting a felony arrest. And so that may be required to be a gun. They're taking essentially your right away to do not what the Second Amendment was imposed after the fact for, but it's taking away your ability to go after the very folks that are sitting in the offices in felonious conduct or omission in sensitive places. Well, the sensitive places are all where they operate. And so I don't want to get too deep in all this stuff. To me, it's self-evident. Like I told you before, if I had never understood, and I didn't for a long time, what the heck does self-evident mean? I'm sure getting a big eyeful of what it all means now. It's not. It is. There's just no question about it. It is. As I tell you, we don't bring questions. We bring a fact. We bring the reality. We don't mess around with these incidentals as a question, as some opinion somewhere. And I got a little bit of that happening on the Twitter here this week. I'll maybe touch a little bit of that. But the Oregon Bar Association comes right out, pulls the gloves off. They don't want you having your guns. They're going to they're inserting the police power imperative, which I don't see. I don't see an ability to impose that on the Second Amendment. But see, the bar associations in the seated decision on that decision that makes the bar members make a question to get it answered. And I've been telling you that I don't believe that there's any place in the law that allows them to make that a question to be answered. In fact, and I got an email, and thank you for the email in question. I didn't want to make it a secret. I just wanted to allude to it. Was this provision of patent in the law? Courts are prohibited to allow the maintenance of a suit for patent to affect, what was it? Set aside, annul or cancel was the three, or impact a patent to land, or even a patent, even if you call it the intellectual property. The courts are precluded from doing that by a law, if you can find that in your states. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. There were certain things that were not touchable by the government, not even by fancy pants dance legalisms. And this is what they've done to your laws now, and this is what you need to stop. And if you don't, they're being taken away. They're taken away in a way. You'll still be able to exercise yours in your place, but you will be dealt with pretty handily. As you see, people who now stand up are now being dealt with pretty handily. The example of which is, the latest one I saw. If you're driving drunk, you can be killed right in your car. I don't know if you've seen that video. No, I'm not saying you should drive drunk. What I'm saying is that the due process is that you become a threat to the military officer in the costume of a peace officer, and they can now shoot you dead. As I told you, it's coming. And I just looked over. I'm looking and I see the chat, RLM chat, but I can't make out context, so I apologize. I see some points being made, but I can't respond to that, just so that you know I'm not really ignoring. Well, I am ignoring it, but because I can't keep on focused on that. But I saw some things that I would like to bore down on, but I don't know if I can get it right. So I'm going to apologize there and keep moving. And I do appreciate your thoughts on that. I just can't integrate. I'm not that able to integrate all this stuff. To me, I guess it's these concepts are very, very deep, comprehensive conditions that I want to keep track of. The broadcast goes pretty quickly, even 2 hours and such. I try to bring as much as I can, and so I can't split my time and be interactive that way. Enough time on the excuse. American Bar Association asks states to adopt firearm confiscation law. Where is that in the Second Amendment, folks? Again, I mean, I could go on and on. I don't want to. I just want you to know I'm just barely able to keep ahead from week to week, ahead of where this thing is starting to roll so quickly. I'm not fully sure how to combat it always. Not always, but overall on this. They bring it by police powers. I told you have to speak to that. In fact, I now see, as I've said before, you have to bring out that the police power is now a pretext to destroy what the organic now, not statutory, but the organic establishment was made for, that these usurpers are overthrowing, the definition of which is now you have to throw them out. As I say, that mining districts were good at that. As soon as they saw an attorney show up and kind of convolute everything that the miner might have done to help himself in their governments that they had, they'd run him out on a rail. They didn't take this nonsense. So that we can focus on one of the bar members' things, but they've created a whole other consensus system and brought that in, which obfuscates this even more. We identified the university system. The lawyers are part and parcel to it. And so this is not unknown, and it's not an opinion that this stuff is going on. So integrated with this, I want to go back again last week a bit and just to touch base that I'm continuing in a way. And I can't get to all of it, but from week to week, it's pretty consistent. The attack is really consistent and always coming. I mentioned about the same legislators. They're called lawmakers. They're not lawmakers. They're policymakers, I guess is the other thing as I look at this. I forgot to point. There's lots I forget to say on these points as I think about them during the week to bring to you. But it says last week at Oregon lawmakers debate whether they'll study federal to state land transfers, and I talked about that. That's a fiduciary breach on its face. But remember, these lawmakers are not lawmakers. They're literally merely policymakers. They make no law anymore. And I can tie that directly back, again, for Oregon, you can tie it directly back to 1953. And where would I suggest do you go look? You want to see that? Go to ORS 174, and then go down to subsection .510 and start reading till 560, and you'll see the supplantation of the permanent laws of the people written right there. The Oregon Bar Association, which is what HB2 is, threw out the permanent laws of the people in favor of their Model Business Corporation Act. Right there, at least, is where you can see they make only policy now. There is no law. And so this Oregon lawmakers publication here is a lie. They're looters. They just loot the place, and we are letting them as the people, men and women in the state. And these people are, to the large part, also the bar members, aren't they? And so you see, you're an occupied people and don't understand it. What I'm pointing out here, getting to this about the federal to state land transfer, was getting to the federal law. These legislators try to make decisions they don't have right to make. It becomes an interaction of the federal and the state government. And when you get into the way the bar members have pulled this together, and they throw the consensus process over the top, dispute resolution, and make this non-constitutional in its application, they remove you right out of your law. It's kind of like the frog in the boiling pot. You turn the water up from comfortable and keep turning it up, and the frog doesn't know the water's changing. Well, that's what they've done to the establishment of your organic government. It's been supplanted. That ORS 174.510 to 560 will use the word substituted, the permanent laws of the people, and that's the word supplanted. That's what I've been telling you about over time. That's why I can tell you with confidence and not arrogantly so that this is a big problem, and we keep letting these people run our lives. We get into the fact that they want to start causing land transfers. Well, it's come up in the news, it's come up in the reports, and now I'm referring to a place called a new follower on the Twitter as well, and thanks to Vince for pulling all this together to get us to start seeing each other. Free Range Report now. I got two articles from Free Range Report. Who touches public land matters, and you may be in the city and you may not think it matters to you. You're just an urban prisoner. Those of you in the cities that you think it doesn't matter, you don't realize the prison that's being made and the prisoner that they're making of the countryside to help to get you to get to the next time in a constrained condition. That this public land so-called condition is very important to everybody, actually. There's a report and a study based on this public land, however, counter to what Oregon wants to do on transfers, is that Zinke, the new department director there, Congress gradually shifting paradigm on public land stewardship. If you read this story, they're actually attempting to push this private state thing at the federal level. Now, when you get this kind of an integration, this is another style of plunder going on from the state to the federal. And there's nobody, either state or federal, to really get in the way of it as far as the system people, the government people, which are all essentially bar members for the most part. And we found in Utah, as I've explained before, Ken Ivory, his attorney, was a representative. I don't think he's in office anymore, but he went around with his road show and he pushed this land transfer issue in his Republican Party. And I pointed out he had 6 major, very big and criminal impositions that they were this plan, this so-called solution revolution that he was pushing was to the facts of the solemn obligations of the governments to the people, both the state and the federal. That this land transfer paradigm shift being shoved through Congress is a very serious problem for the people. And people are not understanding what this problem is. The transfer to the states is the very thing, the point of the cession of the land, of the territory of the state to Congress was to not allow back to the states. And until we get a hue and cry from people generally, and in particular, we see these things in the news going down where people are getting beat up by the federal government over so-called federal land, public land, or the name they want to put on them. We're not going to be pushing the exact point of protectable interest for the people as against those in government. Because it's not the government, remember. It's those in government that have usurped those offices. And I go on and on about this. This story that he's written on this article talks about this overthrow, essentially, that's being working through the system. I think it's possible to interfere with it. In fact, you'll see how input from the people becomes really important, and it is recognized. And this is what I tell you about the din of the mass of the people can actually cause a change. It needs to focus on some of this. The subject matter that they talk about tries to talk in sweet language all about how handing over local control is important, but the local control is not the type of control that you would think is good. It ends up being managed by these consensus policy provisions that, if you were listening to Ron Stevens in his Rock the Boat in UCY, he's talking about direct democracy. They put this property underneath a vote on consensus that if you don't have the power in the numbers, which you won't, because of the way the ignorance of the people are, you will give them the power to, under consensus, to make policy that constrains and attacks anybody with what they perceive to be a higher property right, which is actually your property right and your right to make the wealth. They're going to come after you. It's the hidden way of doing the direct democracy, but it's a violation of the organic laws. And what's referenced in this here, the Zinke article, is I'll read the paragraph so I can be less esoteric. Zinke told senators on his confirmation hearing in several public appearances since that one of his heroes was Theodore Roosevelt, the Republican president who doubled the number of national parks and signed the 1906 Antiquities Act. At a White House roundtable, the reporters in July, Zinke talked of lessons learned from John Wesley Powell, who surveyed the West with the United States Geological Survey in the late 1890s, and Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of United States Forest Service from 1905 to 1910. Okay, so you hear this, and from my standpoint, what I've seen going on, those are the folks he talked about that are his heroes that are haven't actually helped us at all. And that being said, remember he said the 1906 Antiquities Act. I want to touch another story that's happened to show you that if I could say people's input in an impropriety in the law shows you that the law we haven't got the final say, but the law is the objective basis. That black and white, I tell you, though we don't see too much recognition of it recently, What's coming here now is possibly going to be an example of strict construction and application of law that I know certain of us people I work have a direct connection by our comment and our discussion and our interaction with this process of review that came through this 1906 Antiquities Act for monuments that essentially were, and it's now been found, were just promotions by essentially the eco-terrorists and the non-producers to continue to make non-use out of the public lands. That's waste. I've also explained to you that's also a war crime. Now, if you don't think we're not in a war, and I can find it everywhere, not because I'm looking and I see it every place. I'm a hammer looking and I'm going to see a nail. No, it's there because it's there, because you can see it doesn't follow objective basis, and it doesn't make peace. There's no peace around where any of these people go. Now, let me point out before I move on to Gifford Pinchot, the first chief U.S. Forest Service director. He actually identifies or brings forth this idea of conservation. But as I've told you before, the conservation that he imposed, or not imposed, but used as his policy, is wholly different than what they've changed it to today. Conservation today is non-use of the watershed. Conservation under Pinchot was the intensive, continuing use, the sustained use, not sustainable use, but sustained use. In other words, the ONC Acts state, and this is a reversion of the grant to the railroads. When they didn't do the grant, the land got pulled back and then was reset up to be for timber to the local counties out west in those lands, and it was supposed to be for sustained yield of timber, not sustainable timber. And you have to listen very carefully, because these eco-terrorists and these conservation non-use people use all these different sounding but similar sounding terms to impose waste on your lands. And non-production of the watershed will eventually cause problems. And you hear it all the time. The fires. This is the particular season for fires. You hear it in the beetle problems. You hear it in the problem with the waters. Too many trees on the land, it sucks too much water out of the ground. Your groundwater levels go down. There's a really interesting balance, and the only way that it can be really balanced is as man's development, proper development. And that's, I told you before, left to the experts, if I can use that. The people who are actually doing the development, are the ones that actually know about it. They suffer all the consequences, take all the risks. The urbanites do none of this. It's the urbanites that are making the policy, trying to do the servitudes upon and making the serfs of the countryside that produce for it. So I see right here in this discussion about this so-called paradigm shift an illegality going on in the middle, and Zinke is told the Congress that he's going to continue that potential illegality. So that being said, it's interesting that there is a voice, an ear to hear in Zinke, as Trump required a review of these monuments, these wasting away of large tracts of land. The Antiquities Act only provides for 5,000 acres to set aside for an object that of much importance to be set aside to be protected. That's what the Antiquities Act is, an object of antiquity that they provide up to 5,000 acres. Well, that thing has been used now and expanded to take up hundreds of thousands of acres. There's millions of acres under monument status that, now that I'm into looking at it over the last few years, have absolutely no basis to be taken away from you all for production. In other words, it may be land in common, but there's only a few types of people and things that can develop that properly. The miners, the farmers, the ranchers, the timber, agriculture is kind of timber, the timber people. Then you have maybe the wood products people. Those are the people that have to work with their hands and work with the land. That's what brings this resource out to y'all that are not there. Those people that do that have special knowledge, and I'll just, having done numbers of things in nature, and I call the watershed, you think it's that drainage. Yeah, it's the drainage to your locale, but it's the entirety of it and how it functions. It's not a view shed. It's not a landscape. No, it's a watershed. It's a functioning biological entity, and it has to be maintained by man, or otherwise it goes wild and kills itself. It doesn't. It kills it. It keeps changing, but it's not necessarily for the better, and it doesn't produce much more than the ability for it to continue changing. That, notwithstanding Zinke's presentation that he agrees with some of these people, I would show have, in some regards, not actually done what we needed to be done, or their concepts were allowed to be altered. It's possible Zinke has an ear to hear that there's excesses, there's not strict construction examples that needed to be pulled back. Trump said, let's review those monuments. In particular, one we were involved with commenting to, there's another one in Utah, I think it was the Bear Ear or something. They're all over the nation, take thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres of land out of production, and it goes to waste. But the 10 biggest takeaways from Zinke's monument review summary, as Trump has asked, and I told you this, there's a very narrow window for us with Trump. And it's been diminished and diminished, but it's still here. That we can get land. I told you my whole thing about this was underneath the prior regime. There was no way to get this to be through. They were going to be taking more and more land away from production and hurting the country faster. Trump allowed a little breath of fresh air. Well, this is happening and coming to fruition. Notwithstanding Zinke's statement that I interpret with question, when it came out to do the review under the Antiquities Act, and as reported as a free-range report, and you can get this, I think one of the few people that really talks to this thing is this free-range report. It talks about the report that's going to send back in summary form that was sent back on Thursday. Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke sent his monuments review report to the White House for his final approval by President Trump. Now, this is the summary we're talking about. We've never seen the big one. I wanted to get down a couple things here. They're very important. About it wasn't just the government or Trump thinking that they were going to do it. And my whole point on this to my colleagues was, I don't know about, we'll see what they do, but I'm more interested to see why they do what they do and whether or not they're going to do a reverse plunder against the law, or do we have the law to rely on? It just the summary here from me to you, it sounds like they're going to actually do it for the right reasons. And I'm not saying because I agree that they're doing it with what I agree with. No, it's under the Antiquities Act, the authority that these presidents were saying that they have to take tens of thousands, 100,000s of acres and put them into waste. They're saying that there's a limit. Now, my point on this is if it goes that way for all of you all and us and my colleagues, then we can go back to strict construction in the black and white I've been telling you we need to do. Why is that important? Because when they're coming on with stuff like using police powers imperatives to take your guns and your property and your rights and put you in administrative constructions underneath attorneys that won't actually advance the proper things, you're going to have to understand what that strict construction is to protect yourself against the system in many subject matter areas. So moving back to the statement here that was made in the report, for final approval of President Trump, from the beginning, when in April President Trump set forth his executive order for review of all national monuments created and enlarged since 1996 by presidential use of the Antiquities Act, this process has been guided by the idea that states and localities should have greater control over their public lands. The Interior Department press releases reiterates the administration's position. The review was initiated by President Trump in order to restore trust in the multi-use mission of the department and to give rural communities a voice in federal land management decisions in order to make the process transparent and give local residents and stakeholders a voice. So I don't know if you've heard the broadcast, you know I've got a ton of problems with the way they're setting this up, but let's continue to go with it because whatever the crossover is going on in order to get us back to the strict construction of the statutes, we may have to give up while the language starts to turn back in trying to meet people's expectations under the misinformation they've been getting. Everyone expects transparency. They don't know what that is. They expect that stakeholders are something good. They don't know what those criminals are. And so we have to kind of go with this while they're moving it back, because if they're moving it back to the strict construction of law, those stakeholders go away. The transparency goes to the law. It's no transparent at all. You see everything. And the local resident's voice is not resident's voice. It's what is required under the law. and it's no voice at all for the residents. The law deals with the disposition, not people's opinions. And as I've said over and over, these dispositions are not popularity contests. And if one thing I can take away from this multi-point review that the Free Range Report does, for me, notwithstanding what's here and written, is that this is not a popularity contest, and this is what's identified as one of the points of importance. I say it my way, they say it a little bit different. It's not the numbers and the millions of voices that would come around the nation to support these monuments. It was that there's a law that has to be recognized, that the people who spoke up, a minority, that's saying that the law was not being followed, and because it wasn't followed, you're now causing harm, were the voice that actually gets the hearing. And so I took a little bit of, I don't know what comfort, but it's a encouragement that there's an ear to hear, if I can say the minority, the actual one in the law. It has a place to settle today, given what this says works out, that it appears, and I don't have any fact at all about this, it's conjecture. I've got a couple of grapevine discussions, but in fact we don't know. It looks like if the strict construction's held to, these monuments are going to be reduced down greatly. And they're claiming that it took public input in order to be able to do that. What it actually did was took Trump to review it. They then went out to the locales and they said, well, what's going on here, folks? What wasn't listening? I think they're doing a political thing in this, because the law required different, not political input and not public input. There's no opinion here that runs this. There's a factual designation that has to be resorted to on an object underneath this Antiquities Act. But I think for those of you that are into this and want to understand a little better this dynamic, it's going to be very important that you get on the Blogcaster and find the link and read through this stuff. And I'll be interested to see what's happening. I found it very interesting, a couple of statements that were made in trying to balance people's perception. The eco-terrorists expect you're going to put this in a non-use, but the laws are for production and intelligent production. In other words, improving the yield and improving the watershed. That's what Pinochet's plan was, and not what it's turned into be non-use. So within the plan of improving forest use or watershed use, as you start to work this through, you start to see, well, if I'm going to be harvesting at nominal levels to keep the forest in the forest, the trees in the forest, I'm going to reduce. There's a scientific analysis that's done and it all depends on areas, but you only can have so many trees per acre. If you go through and harvest all those places by that method, you start to also find out that method, that separation, that unnatural but proper growth rate is achieved, that maximum growth rate, and your fire danger goes down to level 1 just by properly putting the number of trees there. Then you have a minimum water take up by the trees, but maximum to them to sustain them, and then any extra comes down. That's a minimum thing. There's a whole lot that goes on behind how this works when you properly manage the watershed, not into non-use or waste, but into production and development. In other words, like they talk about the so-called endangered species, we find certain animals thrive where there's man's development, proper development, and they don't exist where there is none. And then so when the eco-terrorists and these war criminals, these non-use of the watershed people start imposing themselves, they start complaining about the birds and the animals that don't live around there's no numbers anymore, and then they blame the producer. That's a self-inflicted wound from the natural course of things. So we have an unnatural usurpation imposed by perception and feeling and opinion, that the law says otherwise, that when you start imposing the law, imposing opinion, things start to work out a whole lot better. And this 10 points here goes through that provision. What I found interesting is one of the directions were the comments by opponents of the monument of the current scope and size of the national monuments in question generally supported traditional multiple use in the areas and were submitted by local residents associated with industries such as grazing, timber production, mining, hunting, fishing, and motorized recreation. So the minority was looked at, and the minority was the producer. Now, they put on motorized recreation. Highways are not a recreation. They're appurtenant, the need to do the production. And so you see a little bit of commingling here of aesthetics versus production and watershed. The point was, we're looking potentially here, not hooray, we're going to reduce the monuments. It's that we're looking at the strict construction of law, the example of which we can take the strict construction everywhere. And that might lead us back to things like that Second Amendment interference that the Bar Association members are really keen to and have the momentum to take out on you all while you sit as crickets. So one aspect of this public land and why I was going here was also there's other things that have been going on in the public land, and it happened to be something that I kind of walked into, didn't expect it here this last week, was people went out on the public land and say, hey, this public land is the people's land. It's not the BLM's land. It's not the environmental terrorists' land. It's not the stakeholders' land. You don't have right to close this out, and you don't have right to interfere with what I should vested claims on the land, of public land, and you don't have the right to make administrative impositions without due process and to pretend there was due process and attack people. And what I'm getting to here is what you saw over the last few years, the attack against production in these same lands that are to be for production. And you see the federal agencies are counter it. These people in the agencies are really war criminals, as far as I can tell. We got it's not an opinion. We could go through all the things. It would be just document after document, documenting how this all lays out. They operate contrary to the law. They have it's a cult of crime inside the agencies. It's this cult of conservation, which is non-use, not the type that Pinochet was talking about. It's non-use, not improving sustained use. Was the issue of the Bundy matter? First you had the Bundy, the BLM attacking the Bundys down in Nevada, and then his sons got riled up, went up into Malheur, and then you heard about the Malheur, and then you find out after they go through all this nonsense to the courts, because the federal government didn't like that, you find out that those people, most of them up there in Portland, in the trial in Portland, were acquitted. No crime. Now they're trying to beat them down here in Nevada, or not here, but down in Nevada. And I've been continuously saying that the attorneys are not presenting the proper defense. And we just happened to go through here on Twitter, very difficult, but I don't think I did too bad in keeping as Gary L. was saying, I was asking me if I was herding cats again, and I said apparently so, on a subject matter that was important to discuss, and I had a request from Vince to do so. And I've been shying against this one, and I think I'm going to just only do this in a summary way, because this type of a remedy is it's not difficult in that you can't do it. It's difficult in what it takes to pull it together to do. It's what I did for us in 2013 lawsuit to go after the fraudulent authorities called the United States District Courts, and their fraudulent imposition of authority where they don't have any. A discussion came up, and this is my problem with the Bundy issue on both Oregon and Nevada, was that nobody challenged the authority of the United States District Court over its competency. The court itself, the establishment of the court, they didn't challenge the territory, which doesn't exist in the states, unless it does, but it's in very, very small areas, and I can address that in a moment. The territorial court has no territory. That really speaks more to venue, but let's just leave it in a challenge to the authority. And then the judges that are running this in those courts, do they have competence over the subject matter for the purposes? My finding before 2013 was that these USDC courts don't have that. Now I've talked, and I went back to I think BTWRLM229, and I listened to where I had put down that the Quo Warranto was being discussed. Well, I mentioned it. I really didn't touch it. It's not as easy to discuss for you as an injunction is, which I can send you to Wiki. You can see the 4 points. It's real simple to see how that lays out. the 4 points are a little more technical than just the 4 points, but you see how to lay out an injunction, even by wiki. You could follow that and actually do pretty good for yourself, understanding what the 4 points, the requirements are. Quo Warranto is what I'm talking about. It's not so easy. It's still a writ. It's a common law writ. It's a remedy for a usurpation of office or franchise. It's a usurpation of more, any office, authority, color. It's how you test color of authority. My question, my ongoing, and I'm just flabbergasted that nobody really pushes this through. Even the people that are being beat down by these systems won't pick this up. My point has always been, for all this time, is why doesn't the Bundy people challenge this court? Why aren't their attorneys challenging the authority of these judges, or the court particularly? Because the court is the weak link here, as far as I can tell. The judges may have a commission under Article 3, but the courts are not established in that regard, and they won't. And these courts won't convene. The judges, the administrators of the courts won't convene an Article 3 court, and that's the secret right there. I didn't talk to this at all. I purposely withheld it from the Twitter discussion, what I just said right there. But I give it to you now for those that are still listening, because some of my information, see, I found out it was coming down. It actually happened. I give you information. You think you go run around, you go look at the internet, you bring back a bunch of stuff, you think that's the answer. It's not, folks. It takes a study. You can't work off the internet just as a source of, here, I found the form and do it. I don't just throw the answers out, because it requires that you integrate yourself to understand what the answer means. And the Quo Warranto is one of these very important points, things you have to understand every aspect of it. Why hasn't the attorneys used a Quo Warranto which challenges, it simply says, by what authority do you act? That's really all this thing says. It's a writ to check and challenge the authorities for their authority. So they're not, you prove their authority. Until you do that, they're presumed to have authority. Why hasn't the Bundy people done that? Well, this week, or last few days, I got the ability to step in and kind of address this. And I can't remember how this all worked out. It was actually kind of taxing on me, but I stuck with it anyway. It's hard to discuss things in 140 characters and with links and all. So we'd have to bear with that point. But what it kind of caused me is to think and see how people respond and react on all sides. What this was instigated by was I was simply saying, do the Quo Warranto. And someone stepped in and challenged that wasn't proper. What they ought to have done, in railing against the Bundys, Cliven in particular, that he should have used the data from the BLM data, he should have used that in the case. And I said, well, why would you use that in the case? My point was, why do you use any of that administrative side stuff before you've identified what the statutes say is an incompetent court? Why do you enter into the court when you see the statutes tell you that it's incompetent? Why are you sending and integrating it all with that court? Now, I tell you this, but we've told Cliven Bundy this way before, years ago, and he's rejected this. And this was what I started to see was the problem. Cliven Bundy has his own problem. He rejects. I would have to tell you wise counsel. I think we've been very wise on the information about this. Not our opinion. It's strictly taken right out of the statutes. And with enough study, we can see exactly the deception that the Bar Association is putting on everybody. It formed the basis for how I was able to trap the courts, get a default judgment, and then trap the federal judge in essentially committing treason himself as a conflict of interest, as he was party to the case, as not establishing his answer required under the remedy, and also taking a trespass on the case action, a fraud on the court, destroying due process by changing a motion he had no control over with no jurisdiction into a recusal motion. I got all this in evidence and in record to show how corrupt this court system is, that is not in the record of the Bundys. But here's the point. It's not about all that. Did you understand that needed to be done in every case? You have to do this in every case. And what happened and transpired over the Twitter was interesting. I hope it was instructive for those that were open-minded to the things that have to be done, and not closed like the one that came in to try and claim so much knowledge that clearly was either absolutely ignorant. I think that was big play right there, but also had an agenda that looked like was trying to push people into a certain thought process. And so I had a couple of dynamics to deal with that I think, I don't know how you're going to find it. I guess if you went to the Twitter, to my feed, I guess you could pick up that feed somehow. I don't know how that'll work, but you can click through and see all the stream of communication that went on, and my responses. And I do believe that it would be valuable for those that are open to see how you respond to someone who's completely ignorant or completely agendized or completely closed-minded as to what might be available. What it turns out, Maya was simply suggesting that they filed a Quo Warranto to remove the presumption that there was any lawful competence and to prove on the record that competence existed. Not just in the judge, which is most of the problems I see on the internet. Most of the people go out and see that, oh, this is not recuse. It's you demand from the judge what warrant they have to operate. It's not just that, and this becomes the problem for these land issues. It also becomes a problem because the Jefferson Mining District was a government, not just you and me. And it has a different authority that's not spoken to in the official papers of the state that we mentioned at the end. I mentioned that where people started to get involved, they started to pick up things on the internet to give them guidance. And I said, well, some of those things are good, but they're not complete in telling you what they're not telling you. And there's a deeper study about that. Again, it's really complex. It's not hard once you see it, but we are ignorant. We are not trained. We are not exposed to this stuff. And they did this on purpose to you all. And this is why it's important for us to roll up our sleeves, notwithstanding our dislike of it all, and start to understand better. So Quo Warranto, out of the wiki, just to come straight off, is simple. We don't know how to get too deep at this point. Is a prerogative writ requiring the person to whom it is directed to show the authority they have for exercising some right or power or franchise they claim to hold. And so there's a history you can see. I don't have the time here to get through it all. In fact, as I look down, see an hour has already passed, and just building up to talking to this important point. The dialogue that we went through on the Twitter, the gentleman, I assume he's a gentleman by his name, can't tell who these people are. He got to the point of denying legitimate remedies that states recognize. And I knew at that point for sure that I was dealing with a complete moron, or he was somebody that was trying to push people into the wrong information. At one point, he agreed that because someone else agreed with him that headway was being made, and my response to that, well, that's not headway, that's being a bully. He then got to the point at the end to say, well, we would agree to disagree. Well, that's a one-sided unilateral discussion statement that I don't agree with. I don't agree with someone saying that we must agree on their say that we must agree to disagree. In particular where, in this case, we're talking about objective black and white law, where he denies the remedies in law, he has no power to negotiate, to agree or to disagree. He's simply wrong. And so if you go through and see the dialogue, you'll see how this guy winds around. At one time, I thought he was coming around, actually. I thought I'd finally pointed him in the right direction. And it was very interesting to monitor. There's a Ranchero 42, and I appreciate your input here at the end. And what you did there, Ranchero, if you're ever listening or you see it, I hear this. The difference between the one trying to run an agenda and being a bully, trying to push the international view. He started talking sustainable. He started talking about commons. Folks, we're not dealing in the commons in the public land. We're not dealing in sustainable. We're dealing in production, and we're dealing in disposal. And all the words he used were wrong, and all the points he made were irrelevant. He made no valuable contribution, even though he spoke about, if you look at his description, he's some kind of a scholar whose curiosity is more important than his intelligence. Well, he's no scholar. He's just trying to puff himself up at some point because he's really had no value to bring except interference. And ultimately, for his point and my interaction with him for his sake was really a waste of time. But for those watching and looking in, and again, to Rancho 42's credit, at the end, Rancho 42 takes what I'm saying to heart and starts to pull in links that show that he was interested to actually look at the problem and qualify whether or not what I was saying was the thing that needed to be done. I am going to presume heavily he's going to find, he's got fertile ground, he's going to find what I'm talking about. The thing that will be missing for him at this point will be the status of the district and how I went around what they say you can't do, how I was able to move around the obstruction where they say you have to go to the prosecutor, the attorney general. The attorney general is a bar member. If you look very carefully, you see the constraints of the bar all over this newfangled Quo Warranto. They say they have abolished the Quo Warranto. Well, they did long time ago, but they can't if parts of it didn't fulfill the remedy where they become an obstruction to it. That's a secret. There's a nugget right there. That's how you get around it. In fact, that's what I told you before in passing, whether people picked it up. The newfangled statutory Quo Warranto has been abolished in favor of a process that you have to go through the district attorneys. Well, folks, what if the district attorney is the problem, is the usurper? You see how they constrained you to have to go through their filter through the Bar Association members. You have to figure out how to get outside of it. How you get outside of it is to relate back to laws before their existence that you're entitled to use. I'm saying some stuff that are pretty advanced, but if you hear it now, you can reference it. Put it more or less esoterically. The fact that we have rights relating back to 1866 as minors, the laws of the remedies of that time are relevant to us, not how they've been changed and constricted to deprive us of remedy. What you have to do is identify the limitation and step outside. So once we get past this obstruction that this one guy tries to do in people's minds on wrongly asserting that the government has all the power, and admit just that by that admitting into it that they have it, I'm saying no, you have to challenge that, remove the presumption, and perfect that on the record. I'm not saying it's going to go one way or the other. The statutes say it's going to go one way. How they may come back and tell you that on the record may be a lie, but it'll be standing and you'll have to defend that or attack the fact that it's a lie, it's fraud. But the law says it's not going to prevail, that there is no authority. You can't leave that presumption as a question by not doing the Quo Warranto. And why the Bundy people aren't doing this, or the attorneys aren't doing this, can only be because the attorneys are in control of defeating those people's rights, and it's only before the jury that's saving them right now. For as ignorant as the jury is in all this. To not make the record and leave the presumption, to me, is a fatal flaw that you waive, that I can't see if you do it correctly, why not, if it makes the record, even if they can show they have jurisdiction. At least you know where they're coming from. Right now, the statutes say I couldn't tell where they're coming from except they're a bunch of plunderers, and you're watching, as I told the guy in the Twitter, you're watching. He made up all this fairy tale about what's going on. I said, no, what you're watching is the BLM should have been felony arrested, and what you're witnessing now is the federal government covering their crimes up. And nobody is checking that by a simple writ that's recognized across the country. And so Ranchero 42, and I hope I have the name right, went around and started finding around the states where the state's Quo Warranto provisions are. And I'm looking at a guy now completely different than the denier, who wants to talk how scholarly he is and all this information on where this case has to go, won't make the first question of whether or not that's a lawful authority at all, just assumes it is and wants to be beholden to it. Despite the injustice that you see going on. I have another guy watching. I assume Ranchero is a guy. Excuse me if it's not. Funny how we relate these. But points out in the States that Quo Warranto is a remedy. And so I say, wow, okay, now someone's turned on to the points, finds out from another conversation that Ranchero 42 may be someone who does some study in this. Because when I relate it over, it says, okay, now you see the Quo Warranto. We got to jump over. No, we got to get back to the courts. Go look at 28 U.S.C. Chapter 5. And I'm detailing this a little bit out because, again, Vince asked me, it is a subject matter that is a lot of importance. Those of you that are disinterested, I apologize for your disinterest, but I'm a little bit embarrassed about that as well. Those that aren't, you need to dig in here. I do believe you'll find fertile ground. I'm not talking just to hear myself talk about all I think I know. It's there to go find. Title 28 U.S.C. Chapter 5 is the Act of 1789 that the poster on the Twitter puts up and tells me that those courts are legitimate. And I asked the question of those courts. It was a trick question, and most of you won't understand why it was a trick question until you start reading. Maybe Ranchero 42 will figure it out. And I asked it on purpose to do something to test the poster. Of those that you see in Chapter 5, from Section 81 to 132, I think it is, or 31, which ones are other than territorial courts? Which ones are other than territorial courts? And if you know that, then that was a test for me if the guy was actually scholarly on this point. Well, he came back with another obfuscation. He liked to hop around a lot. In fact, I asked him, I told him, I said, you like to hop around a lot, don't you? And that's just, to me, I call them pencil necks. Their head bobbed back and forth when they're talking to you. They're just bouncing around constantly. They can't settle down, whether it's ADHD or whether they're just lying to you, trying to impress you with all they don't know. You're not going to get to the point with these guys. They're going to do the fancy pants dance around a point, and you'll never get them to lock onto it. And as I found this guy, I locked him down, and I thought he was there, and then he decides to come back and actually attack people. I call referencing sovereign citizens, and Vince actually responds, sovereign citizen is an oxymoron. The next day, I have to remind the guy of that because he brings it up again as, an ad hominem attack, can I call it? Do I call it that? Calling you names? He said what the Quo Warranto was paper terrorism. Folks, I want you to go into your states and find out that if it's paper terrorism, then the state is allowing it because it's a provision remedy in your state code. The problem you'll find out is that you have to go through your attorney general or a district attorney. It's too technical to get around. I explained a bit of how you try to get around that. But even so, if you put your Quo Warranto, and I'm talking about a complete one, not the hijacked ones you see on the internet, not the ones where patriots decided they knew what they were doing, but look completely at the court's establishment, the totality of the court, and question everything in a court and about a court and whether or not it has been lawfully constituted for the purpose and is existent lawfully constituted, and the people that reside in it and their statuses. You have to do the whole thing, question the entire thing, even if you have to go to an attorney general to do that. The question then becomes, if he doesn't, why? You have that one. It's a shall here, so you have to understand your power. So even if it's filtered through, you still have a continuing power. Here's my point. Even if you start finding obstruction of the Bar Association members of the government itself, it fortifies the fact of the injustice. And you have public record, not opinion, not like what I see lots of people talking about going on. Oh, they're being tried for the third time. What an injustice. Well, yes, it is an injustice, but nobody talks about the law on why they're able to go for a third time. You need to settle down and find out why they can even do that and start to look and see inside that whether or not there's a violation. Why can they go after them 3 times? Why isn't double and triple jeopardy? Because the Bar Association they found a hitch in the giddy-up that they wanted to make sure they could pound on people, and they plugged that hole for themselves. And when you research enough on that, you'll find out what to attack to make that point a question. In other words, they do the same thing that they do with the Second Amendment or these other things that were supposed to be untouchable by any department of government. They make an excuse to make an immunity against a provision. And you have to attack that point. and that's going to be beyond what I'm going to talk about here. But Quo Warranto is valid, so that let's not have any question whether or not you agree with me about how it would be implemented and not. It's irrelevant to me. You either know it's there and how to execute it or you don't. Relative to this court, the information I was trying to get to, maybe hopefully inspire people to keep looking, and I did in fact seem to get Ranchero to do so. He was already, I think, on board. He starts to come out, and it was interesting, with lots of other links about the Quo Warranto, people who are trying to file them. A link or two that popped out, I said, were not going to be enough. They're guidance, but they're not really enough. They're not really right. They're not complete. He came up with another website, someone who has done it, apparently filed paper, and I said, now that's a very good guide as to the court cases, because I suggested, while you're reading Chapter 5, and it's a hard read, folks, because it's very difficult when you don't understand of the courts that they're talking about under the 1789 and the one that they were supposed to maintain, it's hard to parse through Chapter 5. So I suggested, because I noticed I had someone who wanted to go learn, I said, go look for the court cases that identify what the United States District Court, the USDC court is, and what it is or what it's for. Find the court cases that talk about that. Well, interestingly, he almost immediately found a website that actually has a lot of the court cases. And I said, that's a very good guide. And I said, but you don't take that copy and paste. You go in and you find out what each case talks about, and then go to Chapter 5 and apply what you're reading to what you see, and go to the Cornell website for the law and look in the notes. And I'm just giving you what I did, folks, to find out years ago how this thing is this corruption is transparent to you, and the totality of the injustice going on in the Nevada, the Ammon Bundy, the Malheur rebellion against this usurpation of land disposal, proper land disposal, and proper development and use by people who have right to. The argument by the poster on Twitter was that Cliven doesn't have any property rights. And I was pointing out a couple of times, which he'd ignored completely, that there was claims to forage back in the 1880s, which were a property right. Now, let me give you a little insight for those of you that are still hanging in with me. Remember, I told you that miners were outlaw when they were miners before the mining law. They were outlaw to the government and trespassers on their own land as it was determined by the courts. However, the miner being out in the land, the public land that they call now public land, it's actually public domain once you've acquired it. It's no longer open to disposal. It shifts from public land to public domain. Always look very carefully at that distinction. But the miners out in the public land looking around and then collecting up gold were literally outlaw trespassers. And they did it nonetheless. A court case in 1864 turns up where somebody was attacked by the government about being that trespasser. It was a Sparrow case. And that court determined that because the Congress forbade the miners to be there, in other words, they didn't throw them out. The miners were occupiers on their own soil somehow. But if they didn't get stopped by the federal government, the Congress forbade that they allowed it. Subsequent to the 1864 Sparrow case, 1866 is the first mining law that then makes it a grant lawful that the miner be there, so that there was no question. For certain minerals is the same forbearance, it appears to me, that the Bundy family claims back to, in relation back to, in the claim for the forage, the use of the grass on top of the thing, which is a property right that was given over to the state to manage. It is a trust service management by the family after Taylor grazing, which was completely ignored by this poster, who wanted to look in the BLM data and not go back to what rights were traded as consideration for and an honor obligation upon the BLM to honor. was a big missing link inside of these whole cases. That if you apply the statute I told you to read, was where you can go reference it in Oregon statute 12.040. I don't think I said it. Oregon statute 12.040 sub 2. You'll see that patents cannot go to court. They cannot be set aside, annulled, or canceled, or impacted in any way. The claim of forage is such a claim in forbearance by Congress, that subsequently goes ahead and grants it anyway. Why? Because all these lands are, what did I say? There's a pre-existing claim of possession on the lands by the people for those designated lawful uses, such as highways. That the courts, under chapter 28 U.S.C. chapter 5, there's the bulk of the courts there have no cognizance over. In other words, the Bundy matter has been brought into a fraudulent competency by a fraudulent means, and the Quo Warranto is the only remedy I have known that can straighten that out. That nobody is bringing up. I can't. It's not a silver bullet because I don't know what they're going to respond to. I have a suspicion when they do that, the court judge will do fraud on the court by transferring it, converting it to a motion for recusal, as Vince posted, a recluse. I said, well, the judge may be a poisonous spider, but it's actually recusal, no L. They fraudulently convert your writ, a remedy in common law, to a motion under the court's disposition, which is underneath their territorial authority, which is irrelevant, incompetent. I'll just leave it that they said the right word. But the Quo Warranto is the only tool I can know to put forward. Once you understand what Chapter 5 is saying, and you can identify and I'll give you the number, two Article 3 courts that are not of the bulk a territorial or legislative court, then you will start to see what's being covered over, and you will then have the grounds to move forward with a foundation that's unshakable. And you'll be able to identify exactly how, when they respond, how they've tried to dupe you, as we were able to do in our case in 2013, as we sent a default back when the court did not respond. The Quo Warranto shall be responded to. It flips the burden over to the one who claims to have a power to in this case, hear and decide. There's no way underneath that provision that it can be decided by the one you impose it on, or can be determined to do or not do. It shall be answered. This is a cutting right at due process. A court acting without competence is the decisions of which are void. And this challenge is a jurisdictional challenge up front. It can be done at any time, as I understand these laws. And it seems to me, even those that are convicted, understanding what I see, and I have not an opinion, as I told the poster on Twitter. It's not my opinion these courts are incompetent. I have a default judgment that proves it is, and the Bar Association was a party and agreed that these courts are incompetent. The judge, who's a bar member, agreed these courts are incompetent. It's not my opinion. So I know maybe a lot of you folks are not interested, but this is when you start to see this, it becomes the backbone you start to use to show these aren't opinions that we're fighting against these incompetent powers. I don't mean incompetent like mentally incompetent, although they're pretty insane. I'm talking about lawful competency. The lawful establishment, the lawful commissions, the lawful executions, the lawful provisions of territory that they're over. Let me get to that point about the territory, which pushes into venue, which I shoved it into the Quo Warranto as an official office in a way. Again, I went after not just the judge. I went after the court that judge believed he was residing in. I went after also the territory over which it thought it had control. Let's get to the territory. And I can't remember now where it was. You'll have to find it. There's a definition. It's a maritime definition. It apparently looks like a maritime definition, but it says it's a maritime and territories definition. And there's, I think, 3 or 4 definition parts. I think the third or second of which actually doesn't talk about water. It talks about land. And so where is the territory? That definition will tell you. And until I just recently found it, it's again, all the stuff I've forgotten in my life here over this stuff, it came back and said, oh, that's where I've seen that. No different about this Oregon Statute 12.040. Oh, it wasn't in the Constitution like my mind thought it was. It's over here. It's a prohibition against the courts from interfering. What's the territory? Well, they'll describe it. Let me give you the short answer. It's over those things that were ceded to the government in the Constitution for those needful buildings. That passage in the Constitution. It's also where the United States government acquires land. And guess what, folks? That's it. Unless you have a land ceded by the state to the federal government for its purposes, not like the one ceded in the enabling acts under the trust obligations to dispose back to the people, but the ones used by the government itself or those acquired by the government itself, federal government itself, is not a territory. Now let's get back over to those lands that were ceded for disposal. Are the public lands then territory of the United States? Were they acquired by purchase by the United States? The answer is no. So a territorial court's territory is limited to some very narrow places. Did not include the Bundy's forage rights area on public domain. See, that was taken, and the miners had coexisted with the Bundys. That was not a public land anymore either. That was public domain. It actually was not under multiple use either. And so we have a land, a soil, that has no actual authority from the federal government can wield over it by the court itself. So what have I been absenting the most of this discussion for you? What is the court in the Constitution? What's the competency over, subject matter over in the Constitution? It's not territorial legislative courts, is it? The Constitution on the federal side says Article 3 is how you decide the competency of a court under Article 3 matters and subject matter. And those courts deal in your so-called personal, your private rights to things that the federal government is responsible for. What the territorial courts are not are Article 3 competency, which is required for the people in the Bundy issue. And all these other issues, for that matter, that relate to private rights. The claim of forage is a surface right claim. It's property. Forborne by the government Congress, agreed to later when it gave stock entry rights. It's called a split estate where they do that. It's not a whole estate. You got the surface rights, and then you have the subsurface, the dominant estate. You got to keep track of all this stuff. It's not that hard. It's easy once you see it. You start, again, get down to the law of the land. So, Quo Warranto is the only tool I know, contrary to the poster that was fighting me left and right all weekend, trying to persuade everybody that as scholarly as his moniker might claim for himself, he wasn't. There's a way to get through this and add it, and I felt pretty good near the end that I had addressed him and those looking in fairly squarely, I suppose, for as bad as squares might be for most people, as the four corners of destruction might come upon me. I think I did it in a way that was fairly instructive in 140 characters per post. I say that because it's important to notice as I was looking at this, I've got an education that I can provide for people given that they're willing to see. Are they willing to hear what I'm saying and hear in the idea of seeing and going and reading? And the fulfillment of which was, again, Ranchero 42, going out and just finding out all this information. which I told him later. I mean, I said I can't qualify all this information over on Twitter. But I can suggest looking for these certain things. And the one post that had a lot of the court cases, not all of them, but a lot of them, some of them, I should say, not a lot of them, but it was a valid place to start the study. And I think, again, I'll say it one more time, I think the study was fertile ground for anybody interested in understanding what we are up against in this country and what is in our face a crime. These courts, listen, folks, I've said it before, I'll say it right now, it strikes me. The public trust is gone. And I'm finding it fascinating. There's very few people that understand how to expose that, let alone it being our first knee-jerk response. See, it's my first knee-jerk response now. It was so much so that in 2013, I was ready to go. I had already planned out how essentially the future of the case based on prior impropriety of the courts that I had to learn over decades and watching other cases being mistreated by the judiciary and the bar members and the clerks. And so by the time 2013 rolls around, I have a knowledge you don't get just by looking at somebody's website and copying and pasting and even reading other cases. I have an experience that shows me I'm up against a major corruption, and I'm figuring out how am I going to deal with that. So the Quo Warranto isn't just the end-all be-all. You're up against a literal corruption that you can predict, and I dealt with it. It came at me. I dealt with it. I say I did because I had to set the plan. I had to set my colleagues on the mind to see that it was coming because they didn't even have this experience. They did do that criminal thing, but we came back with them so fast. Part of the stunningness was the fact of coming back so quickly against the crime utilizing this tool. That exposes it just eviscerates their whole system. And I don't know that people will ever really appreciate what our court case, notwithstanding what the record looked like, but when you find out there was no authority in the court, the territorial court that responds to us, and there's no authority in the judge so-called that responds, and the crime the judge commits, when you realize anything that's signed or done in that case other than the default is void, and that the court, the judge, the so-called judge, the impersonator, the posier in the office, had the absolute duty in law to respond and failed, you realize everything that criminal interloper says is an evidence of a crime. It rises to the level of treason. That you'll start maybe to appreciate the real law underlying our case, notwithstanding what your eyes see that they fabricated as a record. So this allows us to see. So you would see that the crime being transparent to you on the record. But if you look to see through who was competent to make anything happen, it was only the plaintiff, that was us. And who didn't answer on that was the Bar Association, was the state of Oregon, was some politics, was some it was the Democratic Party, it was the Republican Party. If you think you got partisan implications, partisan favoritism, stop it, folks. You're still drinking the Kool-Aid. I don't care what color it is. These are all done. This is all usurpation done by the Bar Association and other interests. The public trust is done. Now, where are we going to go for justice is we all have to come up with that. I can't be the only one that knows this. So I'm encouraged by those like Ranchero 42. I don't know what Ranchero 42 is going to find, but I found fascinating the discrepancy between the one that wanted to sell everybody down the river in the wrong way and someone who is open to learning more. And that, I'll just let you know, is encouraging to me. It's slow watching that, but maybe one more, one less ignorant action party, I suppose. If that condemns the rest of you who aren't, that's not my intent. But the facts are the facts. In fact, the question came up: what is reality? And the poster that was literally posting nonsense said he would determine that. And I said, where you deny objectively known remedies in law that even states, I didn't say the parts about the states, that every state recognizes in law, you deny that, you aren't capable of determining reality. And I could tell a little bit of liberalism in the dialogue as well. I can tell a little bit of SJW in that dialogue, but you'll never, I don't think you see too much of that pop out much. I was really focused on getting the focus down to what I was saying and how that was trying to be adulterated by this imposition that tried to change the dialogue, tried to change the focus off of what has to happen. To tell you the truth, folks, I couldn't tell, and I still don't know that one wasn't an attorney trying to persuade people out of actually doing their own good work. I want to caution everybody again. I did say it. I'm going to say it again. Be very cautious to get on the internet and just think that people that you see typing stuff out about Quo Warranto have it all together, because there's a lot of information that's not. Use them as loose guides until you dig into the Chapter 5 and the court cases from the system that talks about those USDC courts, and you understand what they're saying from there. I say that only because that's how I did it. And I think I have a pretty clear idea, and I have a really fast, my observations are pretty quickly getting at how to expose all that. It's really not, again, it's not a question. The fact of Chapter 5 doesn't say those are competent courts. It just says they're courts. And let me give you another hint. I've talked about this, but I do it in passing. I've been saying USDC. Remember, I did a broadcast, those of you who have been listening. United States District Courts. There's another court. They're not talked about much. But the court cases talk about it, and that's how you're going to find it out. And Ranchero 42 found a website that the guy who did the paperwork that he was doing, he uses those same court cases that identify it too. That other court case, that other court is not the USDC court, it's the DCUS court, the District Court of the United States. How subtle the letters shift, but they are different entities. They have different authorities. One is congressional legislative, and the other is constitutional. The ones, most of the ones in Chapter 5 are legislative, administrative, essentially, over a small territory. The Article 3 court is essentially national. It's the constitutional court, where, if you will, personal rights are vindicated. And I'm going to tell you beyond that, not to dissuade you from continuing reading. Even though there's the courts are those DCUS courts are there, I don't know yet that the door is open on them. They're there, but this shows you the obstruction of justice, the constitutional denial of justice that's going on in this country right now. And when I just said constitutional denial of justice, you should have had a heart palpitation. The constitutional denial of justice under international law is probably the highest crime a nation can suffer. And if you didn't know that, please go make yourself knowledgeable about the fact. I don't even want to say more about that. If you didn't have a heart palpitation over a constitutional denial of justice as we review it for the United States, you're not appreciating the depth of the crime, the obscuration, the transparent occupation in your face, and why y'all complain with everything you see going on around us. And it's all a fabrication. And so, I don't know what to say. I get kind of calm now because I think I've said what I said. I think I needed to say what I've said. It's not, what I've said here is just the barest bones. You really have to do the roll-up stuff. This is way beyond this Quo Warranto. When you're looking at authorities, establishment organic authorities, and whether they exist or not, you're looking at a very comprehensive study. It takes a little while, as I told Rancho 42. I said this is a pretty deep study to parse out, but it's there to do. It can be done, and it can be done pretty quickly. I don't mean in days, and certainly don't mean in hours. Certainly not on a website. But it's there for us to do, and if we intend to have any, really, if we tend to move down this road and have a complaint in our mouth, a legitimate one, You're all going to have to understand these things. And if you don't, I really don't know what you're complaining about. I really don't. I really want to see us all, all armored up with this stuff, and then we don't have to talk about it. But we're not in that day. And we're so far away from that day that it's really kind of astonishing. We as a people, I include myself, we as a people, we're just walked right down the road of perdition, apparently. So please consider that responsibility in us. I do believe, if we were to go back to I really think it's beyond a belief. It's beyond an opinion. It really is beyond opinion. Where we put the black and white that was put before us by wise people. In this case, let's go back to public land. Even with the public domain sitting there as the disposed use. Well, let's go to the public domain. The public domain is where it's being used, and being used by law brings production, which then aids secondary and tertiary society. Everybody feeds off, if you will, this production from the watershed. And the laws were made to protect that. As I said, ORS 12.040 says the patents, the land, and their uses granted are not to be interfered with by the courts. There's no justice that can be had to interfere with these solemn disposals. When you appreciate what that says, and the peace that's kept is the peace of the possession of the production, and what the sheriff keeps over that, keeping protection on it, you might begin to see what we're talking about when you're looking at your pursuit of happiness. And when you go there, a lot of the problems start to fall away. You're not going to stop having criminals, but with the way the watershed works, the way societies work, you start to look at a different thing. You're not living in debt anymore either. I don't even know if any of us understand that. To conceive on how that would even be. Why you have to pass tangibility from hand to hand. See, they've got us so far away from these very basic things that we as mankind, that includes women, mankind in the world have had to do amongst ourselves. These, call them the constitutions are compacts or contracts. We've had to have a contract because people, we aren't so good to each other. We take advantage. We got the 7 deadly sins. Capital D, capital deadly on this. And so, I've spent a lot of time, maybe getting a little off point now, but important to go back and not disregard what I talk here to guide you through. I mean, I keep thinking of Rancho 42. I just appreciate going through the dialogue and having someone turn on and start digging into the internet to find things, good, bad, or indifferent, but start working with how to identify the thing I'm suggesting needs to be understood on what may aid the people that are being oppressed and persecuted in these people in Nevada, or it has happened, and the jury wouldn't go for it in Oregon, at least for the most part. And we would expose the corruption that's around us called the courts of the United States or the courts of the state. And that then gets us down to the Bar Association, which is this member who's under the costume of a governor who's signed away the rights underneath this spacious idea of risk exposure to the suggestion by a military officer in a police costume that he can say that you threaten him because he knows you have a gun. Well, that was the purpose of the gun, is to stop his oppression. Or catch him in a felony, if you can get that suggestion to be a felony. Remember, there's another felony I just identified. When they make a claim give information that attacks a claim you can have, and I would say your claim is your right to bear arms, keep and bear. When they make a claim that's false, he's committed a felony, one, and then he's committed a second one for doing it under color of authority. Now, if the law's not working anyway, I don't know what the real answer is, but at least we maintain the law, and we do that part peaceably, don't we? The word in your mouth when that happens is to go as a collateral attack in equity, and you attack him for that felony. Now, okay, it sounds ridiculous going back and making the point in the courts. The point about that is you look at this court case they can't interfere with you if you have a patented right, I can say it that way. And to that point, that court's limited. You tie the hands of the judge. And if not, you make the exposure that there's no system now that we're sitting under that protects us. We have to know that as a people. That is one of the elements we have to eliminate as a question. They keep the question by thinking you have justice somewhere. When you eliminate that faction, when you bring up what the murder memo of 2010 says is extrajudicial, we have no longer have a government, an organic government. You now have empowered the people beyond opinion itself. It takes some people to do that. We just don't do that because of we can go through the internet and do the nonsense I saw being spewed by someone who wants to get the favor of everybody's view and diminish what the law actually can be. As I'm thinking here and getting beyond into this and this Quo Warranto, I actually bypassed, I think, a thought, and I wanted to make a statement to. When I want to get back, I'm going to go back here. I'm going to move on to something. Congress quietly passed a bill allowing warrantless searches. This is how these attorneys are moving right past you. But I'm going to go back to the Pope, and I wanted to talk about Bannon. And remember, I talked about 30 days. I don't know if I finished the thought on that, and if I did, I apologize. I'm going to go back anyway. I want to go back. Remember, about 30 days elapsed before Bannon was gone. I want to go back to last year and talk about. Remember, I was talking, or the year before actually too, as well, and remind you, the Pope is a player still. And remember, next month, we're coming on to it. In fact, almost just short of a month now. The Protestants and the Vatican are going to come into unity treaty about September 23rd. And I was reminded about this on another video I saw. And so, just to bring it back up, that these people are marked players if in the world on the news, on the stage of the news that we can tell to notice. That I also told you last year, be careful, watch this Protestant, the combining, the healing of the wound, if those of you that read the Bible a bit, looks like it could be happening there on a very important day, September 23rd, in a global historic sense. Remember, it's the end of a jubilee. It's all happening together. And might I suggest, it comes interestingly close to, if not on 33 days, but close to 33 days, at least 1 month beyond the eclipse. Which, if I was to get this correct, and I didn't go back and check it, is the same path of eclipse. If I get this correct, if I'm wrong, fine. It still had an eclipse. Let's stay there for those of you that don't want this next part. It traveled that area, apparently, if I have this right. The eclipse traveled the same path as it did at 1776, portending a change coming up in some order in government. I just find these coincidences pretty interesting. At some point, the question is, do they have meaning? That's up for you all to watch. But I want those of you that have an ear to hear and an eye to see, prepare those things that you think you need to do. Again, I think it comes so subtle that it's underneath the perception of most people. Because of the interrelation, I can continually do the interrelation of all these things from local to global, and it's not a good thing that these evil are out there that continue to win the day. We have a narrow path that we have to follow. And in fact, I think Gary L. has posted a Twitter video or something. And I listened into the video, and objective truth is one thing that the globalists can't deal with. And that's the path I keep telling you to follow. This black and white is objective truth given, and I touch it to the land. It's something that can't be messed with. Property is something the globalists and even the local oppressor can't actually mess with. They'll get you to think they can. It's a felony, and if you don't know that, they're going to win the day. If you do know that, you got some measure of control. But objective truth and property are the things that's trying to be destroyed today. You have to find that objective truth, not opinion. I keep telling you, I'm not opinion back on this behind here. I'm on opinion. You have to be. The poster this weekend, again, a couple of days of discussion with this guy. Look, and interestingly, I didn't really have a lot of time, but I got interrupted in something, and so I could go in and out, and I was able to kind of keep up. Otherwise, it was pretty taxing. But I thought it was important that he would come back with fairy tale after opinion, after false fact, after ignorance, one after the other. And I can only tell you I just focused on the subject matter truth point, based in what I could see is an objective basis that everyone has to agree with, which is what we see this land disposal law is going to be our protection. And I don't say it saves us. I say it's a protection. It gives you a whole lot more distance when someone of an evil intent, whether you see it or not, can attack you. You have some protection against it. It's not cut and dried. As I've showed you and explained, even eminent domain is not so cut and dried that they can steal your stuff. As I explained underneath this, and I think Java Doctor was posting lots and lots about this Oregon bill to come underneath the risk, enhanced risk, ex parte complaint against your ability to have guns because the cop is afraid. He fears for his life because you got a gun. He's posted, Java Doctor has been posting quite a bit on that. Even against that, I've explained how that's a pretense, a pretext. That's a felony. If you don't quite get how you can address these things, or that you know that ahead of time you can engage them there to invalidate these things, get the perception in people that they have something to say and have a defense against this, instead of being defenseless or being run down by someone like the poster on the Twitter that I went through. Well, I suppose most people would have been run down by his insistence. They could have been persuaded until he bullied them into agreement, or just didn't get agreement and had left a vacuum over what can happen. See, I didn't allow the vacuum to happen. I allowed him no space to have an authority. He said all that he had no authority. I just accepted that. And then I went with the narrow objective truth that defeats all of this SJW, liberal, so-called progressive, so-called UN nonsense. The destructive forces, the so-called racism stuff. You just destroy it. There's just no air. You don't give it any air to have a life and breathe. Because these people are here systematically taking your rights. And I'll move on now. Moving from the Pope back over to this. I do want you to take special heed. I'm interested now to see how this rolls out. We are to the time. I forgot how much, we went through the year and a year and 2 years, now a year, and now we're down to the time. September 23rd's here in just a couple weeks, and a historic healing, quote, healing, is coming on at a time of very significant historic purpose, in a time of very building darkness. Like I said, it can get a lot darker than we're seeing it. So I don't know where all that goes. I just want people to be aware of it. Be looking around. Be careful not to look too short-sighted. Understand you have a power, and understand you can run light. You don't have to get too heavy on what you need to carry with you. And be aware that if you're open enough, the words and the actions will be coming to you. As I tell you, when you engage, it's amazing to me to listen and see how things start falling in place for you. Maybe not so miraculous, not so in the miracle appearing side, but very subtle aids that come to you when you move in the right, you get on the narrow path. It's still that you have to walk the path. That doesn't go away. But, and it seems like the road is long and you're never going to get to the destination, but it is the fact of the walking. Because you've got people along the side of the road that need to be given an example, and you need to show that you can avoid the people and those that are the plunderers, the highway bandits. You need to be able to show how they can address all that. Moving on now to those that will steal your rights away. While we look up in the sky at the eclipse, which I think was an important sign. At one level, it's just a natural thing that's cool. It wasn't given to me to see. We got a smoke over the area, so I didn't get to really see even the partial eclipse. I didn't get to see the total one anyway. So I wasn't given that sign. Some people may have been. I understand that lots of people were emotionally moved being in the darkest spot and looking up and watching this event. So you can see very clearly that there's something afoot in our nature.
And you can also see something that people could exploit in the past, given that's the point, that's the case. And this is what the parasites prey on these things. So very interesting things to witness if we're open to them. And I'm just asking us to be, as we see going into this time of September and on, it's going to go, it's not stopping. But this may be a new, something may be shifting on a much more deep level here as we go on. And a lot of it is, again, being able to put our time in. As I told you, Zinke did accept from some input. One of the passages in the statement was for timber. Timber was lands were going to be interfered with. I can tell you that made me smile because of the back channels we work through had a big voice in the ONC Acts being interfered with. So we're watching the reflection of response for our input into a system that looks, for all intents and purposes, to be just lawless. But there is this reflection that there's still something we can do inside it and make life even just a little bit better, or start to delay it so more can come as we start giving the example on how to do it, not how not to do it. Because while we were all looking up in the sky, Congress quietly passed a bill allowing warrantless searches of homes. Only 1% opposed it. Was a story. I finally got it through Zero Hedge, but from Free Thought Project that Grimner talked about on Freaker's Ball. That hardly anybody commented to this thing. I guess he was. I didn't notice it. I don't really pay much attention, but because I don't have that many following me, so I don't see I don't see the generic Twitter thing. But he said that not many people were actually interested in this story to pass it along. Alt media, nobody, just us actually. I guess the names I heard on Freaker's Ball was like Gary L. and myself and Grimner and somebody, maybe Vince and somebody else, and we were all like, hey, wait, look at this little thing. I think Gary L. actually posted it, and he pointed out that the Fourth Amendment was being interfered with, that it happening in Maryland. On the surface, House Joint Resolution 76 looks harmless. The title of the bill claims that its purpose is granting the consent and approval of Congress for the Commonwealth of Virginia, the state of Maryland, and the District of Columbia to enter into a compact relating to the establishment of Washington Metro Rail Commission. However, within the document, they allow for search of adjacent lands. And so Gary L's posting was that it was a violation of the Fourth and now in the 14th Amendment as well. But one thing is, you notice this was the agreement by Congress. This is a compact between states, which is required if there's a compact that the Congress agrees. Remember, on the West Coast, the governor of Oregon, Washington, and California made a compact even with Canada, which was completely illegal. So I wanted to point out right away here, these interstate compacts require congressional input. The ones that are done by these governors in international compact to impose sustainable development are all unlawful. All right, but that's a color of authority. That's how Quo Warranto could be used as well. What authority did you have to even enter into this? So that's the first thing I want to point out. You see the Constitution working, but this provision for a search on adjacent lands that are not within the area is the thing that pushed everybody that I know, apparently, that Grimner understands, that I hear through Grimner were the only ones to really bring this up until today, or yesterday, was that this is you see an encroachment that hardly anybody speaks of, and none of the legislators in Congress, the Congress critters, were against. Well, I went back and read the bill myself because I was interested in what's the extent of this. What is this thing? And I found it wasn't just the Fourth, and I twittered about this. I said Section 61 says all other general and special laws inconsistent with the MSC Compact are hereby declared to be inapplicable. To me, it's beyond the Fourth Amendment of the 14th. This says all other general and special laws are not applicable to this compact. Apparently included your Constitution and everything, and the establishment of government and everything else. Is how bold these people are, and they're not bashful to show how bold they are to completely interfere with these provisions. And then they give this little out, the severability clause. Well, if anything here, these provisions are found to be unconstitutional or invalid, then they get severed, and the rest of it doesn't apply. And then they said a very special thing to other people. So if you find out you're being wrong and you fight it, and you fight it correctly, the thing that you found that was invalid isn't applicable as severable to other people. Is how well they're starting to constrain your activities. And this is just something that if you aren't paying attention to it, you're not paying attention to how they're putting the shackles on you at every turn. This is one of the more obvious ones. So thank you for Gary L. pulling this out, and then Grimner for identifying. There wasn't very many people even talking to this, and I appreciated being able to go in and see, wow, this is a pretty destruction of the entire establishment of government. All other general and special laws inconsistent with this compact are hereby declared inapplicable. How'd they have the power then in order to make the compact? They've just destroyed the government with it. How ludicrous the impositions are that we accept. It's pretty fascinating to me at some level. I just don't know what more to say. It's just fascinating. And the imposition we accept. Let's go on. TSA facial biometric body scanners and government watch lists being used in train stations. Almost an old story, but now it's happening. These people aren't bashful to stick it in your face, and you just accept it. I don't know what more to say. They're getting you biometric scanners. Remember, we talked about the problem. This is a third-party company. In fact, I think they talk about the I don't remember now. It doesn't matter. Third-party company's going to be running these things, and they get that database that goes into a national database in private control. Big data under government control and protection. This is serious encroachment, and I hear crickets. I hear, like Grimner. I mean, you got a handful of us looking at this thing, and no comment from the whole of the alt media. Notwithstanding, I'm not media, but even so, you think the news would be coming out railing about how wrong this thing is. Not a thing. And so we have facial scanners. We have scanners at your train station. I told you this was coming. I told you this years ago. In the law, it was a report I was reading. It said it's coming into every provision, and then we see this little thing. Remember, I talked about being different frequencies being able to control you. We've heard the rat stories. Here's another one. Think about this. You go to the train station, all of a sudden you start doing things that you don't understand how. Magnetothermal genetic brainwave stimulation of motor behaviors in a wake-free moving mouse. Mice. Freely moving mice are able to be controlled by magnetothermal bombardment. What do you think they're doing? They can do in these scanners. What do you think that your phone can do? What do you think that they can do on all this? They're not telling us what I told you a few weeks ago is already in the works. They're not telling us that it can happen. They can bombard you with energy and get you to start doing things that you had no clue about. Is that the kind of future you want, I guess, is another question. Who are these people to do this? When you see these, do you collect these stories up and take them in your bag of facts and go to these agencies and say, stop your nonsense? I have a right to not be imposed by this, even in a public place, so-called. I am free from even the threat that you can interfere with me with your technology. And I hear crickets, but we got to break that. We got to stop accepting this and be silent to allow this. And thank you for tuning in today. I hope something I said invigorates you, inspires you, or gives you more direction and gives you some incentive to go in certain areas in the right way. Grimner, thank you very much for reallibertymedia.com and the place for the blogcaster and the archives and the Freedom Network and Social Network. You might sign up. And then Jules at UCY, thank you very much for your podcast, pastcast, and the recast on Thursday. And folks, I'm over at minds.com. You might want to give maybe some hoorays there. Over at BitChute, for those of you who want to try that, peer-to-peer torrent. And so we're kind of doing lots of different things. And again, Vince, thanks a lot. You know, we're getting lots of people are starting to tune in a lot more in lots of places. We have lots of places to do it. But folks, the word's out there. You can participate. I hope you do. We need to as a people. Thank you. I'll be back next week. Tech diffs or nature willing.
Well, that's another lesson. I hope with today's information you can take it to those that misbehave. From behind the woodshed, leaving his mark on the beast, this is Hal Anthony. Till next time, journey with purpose.
That's what opening up a can of whoop-ass feels like.
Son, you just opened a whole case of whoop-ass.